Welcome everyone to the third of the Social Security Advisory Board's speaker series on IT modernization. Please note, as you just heard, that the session will be live captioned, recorded, and posted to our website at ssab.gov. Before I proceed with introductions, please note that the information presented here is for the purpose of informing the board, and the views expressed do not necessarily reflect the views of the board or any individual board member. We're extremely fortunate to have with us this morning two of the nation's leading experts on the modernization of the federal government's legacy systems. Kevin Walsh is the Director of Information Technology and Cybersecurity at the Government Accountability Office. In that role, he reviews the modernization of legacy systems government-wide. He oversees the huge systems employed at the Department of Defense and the Department of Health and Human Services, as well as the nation's satellite and space systems. Of particular relevance to this morning's session, just 3 weeks ago, Kevin testified before Congress on the need to modernize legacy systems across the federal government. As his written statement, GAO reissued its 2019 report entitled, quote, "Agencies need to develop and implement modernization plans for critical legacy systems." I would say that was quite timely for our session today. Our other leading expert is Rob Klopp. Rob spent most of his storied career in Silicon Valley, where he worked for both large software enterprises and smaller startups. Rob held both technical and executive positions. He's worked on the engineering and product side of the business. He's also worked on the front end, focused on serving the public and other end users. Of particular relevance to us, Rob was recruited by the Obama administration to come to the Social Security Administration, where he served as Chief Technology Officer, Chief Information Officer, and Deputy Commissioner of Systems. He currently owns Skyland Digital Services, which is dedicated to delivering innovative solutions as quickly and efficiently as possible. And as I think about it, that would be a great tagline for SSA, quick and efficient. Between the two speakers, we have both government-wide expertise as well as deep knowledge of the Social Security Administration. So here's how we'll proceed. The 2-hour session will be divided into 3 roughly equal parts. Each part will start with a discussion between Kevin and Rob, followed by questions from board members and staff, and then followed by questions from the public. Please know, though, that the staff will monitor the submitted questions and jump in if they think a question is important to be asked during the discussion part. So please feel free to submit questions as they occur to you. Either use the Q&A button on Zoom or email your questions to events@ssab.gov. So we'll start, the first part will be a 10,000-foot view. Then we'll dig down into SSA's modernization efforts. And then we'll conclude with questions about how to measure progress. But please know that we're not going to be rigid, but go where the conversation takes us. So again, please feel free to write questions on anything you want at any time in the 2 hours. So let's start. Let me start with, again, the 10,000-foot view. Everyone kind of generally talks about legacy systems and modernization, but rarely do we talk about what those terms mean. Kevin, let me start with you. What's a legacy system and what is modernization? When does a system become a legacy system in need of modernization? And on the same token, once modernized, when does that system become a legacy also in need of modernization? And do legacy systems by definition have to be modernized?
That was a lot to unpack there. So let me start by addressing the preconception that the government's legacy systems are something out of Indiana Jones and The Last Crusade, where you picture a giant warehouse with tons of ancient dusty boxes. That is not what the government's systems and servers are. these days. Maybe at one point, and maybe there are still some places buried in DoD bases somewhere that I'm not familiar with. But for the most part, a legacy system is something that is not well defined in the government. I think there is no currently viable definition. Every agency basically has their own way of saying this is what we consider legacy, and in the absence of an overarching definition, I think most would agree that a legacy system is something that is no longer supported by the vendor, whether that be hardware, software, or even the code. And this clearly changes a little bit as you start talking about agencies that develop their own code, and there may not be a vendor to support them. But in addition to that, I think it's also critical to consider whether that system is meeting the mission's needs. If it's no longer meeting the mission's needs, whether that be performance or capabilities, we have ongoing legislation, and it seems like every year we get more and more. So as those additional requirements get tacked on, if the system is no longer able to meet those requirements or meet the mission needs as the population using it grows, then I think most would agree that that is a legacy system. Some of the other interesting definitions would be agencies have said that once a system is no longer under development, that is a legacy system. Others have defined it using specific programming languages, for example, COBOL or Fortran or assembly languages. I think some of those can still have use cases where they are viable, others not so much, especially some of the assembly languages which are really written for a specific piece of hardware. So it's a real problem to move that kind of code to a newer environment, although Rob, I'm sure, will have something to say about that. So that's kind of the environment we're operating in. There is no real definition for what is legacy. A modernization, though, I think is a little bit more clear. It's where you're taking something that's old and moving it to newer hardware, newer software, a newer COTS package, commercially off-the-shelf software, which you're basically purchasing as a whole with minimal customization. So I think I addressed most of your questions. Nancy, did I miss anything in there? Rob, do you want to jump in and agree, disagree?
Sure. So the difference I would say is, instead of thinking about what is a legacy system from the perspective of what does the federal government think, I think that what we need to do is set the bar way higher and ask ourselves whether or not the systems that we provide, that we use to run the government, are modern by the standard that commercial business uses, and better still, by the standard that the best commercial businesses use. For example, the big obvious leading software developers coming out of Silicon Valley. I want to be careful and say we don't need to be bleeding edge, but I think to set the standard as if we are meeting the mission, we're okay, is way too low, because what tends to happen is over time the mission tends to be defined by what the systems can do, instead of having the mission defined about what is capable, and trying to improve the delivery of the vehicle we have to deliver systems to the public. So I would set the bar a little bit higher and say the target needs to be that we're providing systems that are as functional and capable and easy to use as the kinds of software systems that we see coming from the best software development houses in the United States. Again, being careful to not be suggesting that we're on the bleeding edge, but not so far away from the leading edge. The second thing I think I'd say is that I think it's useful to, instead of focusing on what is a legacy system, maybe to ask the question of what is a modern system. And then to realize that if the delta between the systems that you have and what would be considered a minimal modern system, something that even a sort of average commercial site would go build, I think that if the difference between those two things is too great, then clearly you have a legacy system. And in software engineering space, we talk about a concept called technical debt. And technical debt is meant to be some sort of a measure between the technology in your current system and the technology that would be put in a system if you were to rebuild it from scratch. So, and clearly, if you use the standard I'm talking about, then there's lots and lots of legacy systems in the government that are in need of upgrade. I think that this concept of technical debt, which is again the way software engineers talk about it, is really important because technology is moving so fast today that you start to accrue technical debt almost the minute that you deploy a system into production. So, for example, when I was at SSA, we did some very early work in building applications that were deployed in the cloud. We deployed a disability case processing system that was in the cloud. But in the early days, the cloud just meant virtual machines that were deployed in some off-premise vendor like Amazon or Google or something like that. But in just the short 5 or 6 years since we first deployed that stuff, the state of the art for cloud computing has grown dramatically, not to anybody's surprise. So today you get a minimal amount of benefit from deploying in the cloud in a virtual machine. You get significantly more benefit, maybe 10 to 100x better price performance if you deploy in containers in the cloud. And there are people that will tell you that there's a next generation that's come out maybe in the last 2 years, which is to deploy in what's called serverless technology, where the price performance can be hundreds to 1,000 times less expensive than if you just deployed a virtual machine. So, another measure of legacy is how far away are you from what is kind of the current state of the art that would be what you would expect to deploy if you built a brand new system today. And again, I think that by that measure, what you'd find is that because of the way we build product in the government, where we invest money, we finish the job, declare success, and go, that's now in maintenance mode. Basically, the minute that we say it's in maintenance mode, we're no longer investing, technical debt starts to accrue, and the systems become legacy. Even the DCPS system, I believe, probably is starting to accrue some technical debt because because of these new advances in the cloud computing, because of new releases of the software that may not be deployed in the product, new releases in the programming language that may not have been upgraded in the product. Every one of those things is technical debt. And again, I'll kind of finish by saying, this problem that we have with legacy is something that we have to learn our way out of. Even 5, certainly 10 years ago, if you built a software system, the accountants, whether they're government accountants or commercial accountants, considered that software system that you built and the money that you spent to build it, they considered that an asset, and they actually put it on the books as an asset. And they, like assets, they said, oh, this asset has 20 years of life. But technology moves so fast today that no software has 20 years of life. No software has 10 years of life. No software, software starts to become dated because of the advances in technology after maybe 5 years. And it's easy enough to keep on top of the advances and minimize, maybe not reduce, but minimize the technical debt so that you stay closer to the state of the art all the time. And I think that it's that sort of continuous improvement and continuous integration mentality and product mentality is really important to build new systems and then keep them closer to the state of the art.
Well, there's a lot there to pursue, and you both touched a little bit on this, but let me sort of dig down. What are the challenges, the opportunities, the risks involved in however we define legacy system modernizing a legacy system.
Nancy, before we get to that, can I react to a few things that Rob said?
Oh, yes, please do.
So I really liked your comment on what can we do versus what could we do. That's really kind of encapsulating the whole discussion of what legacy systems should be. Technical debt is also a very, very big problem in the government, where you don't know how much money you're going to have in your budget on a year-to-year basis, right? The way that appropriations work, you could get $100 million for modernization one year, and then the next year your budget's at 40 million, even though you asked for 80. I also would note that I wholeheartedly agree that no software should have a life of 20 years, but all too often in the government we see those software and these programs live for longer than they were expected.
So I want to follow up on one thing Kevin just said, which I think is really important, and that is that an awful lot of these technical issues that we're going to talk about through the rest of the session today really aren't gated by technology or the desire of technologists to do better work. It's really gated by the fact that the way that we allocate funds, to Kevin's point, the way we allocate funds is really not caught up with the speed of technology. And so we still basically have to account for dollars using old waterfall methods that basically say, okay, you tell me what the 5 steps are from here to done, the design phase, the build phase, the deployment phase, blah, 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 blah. I expect you to hit the timelines for all of those things. And then when you're done, you're done. And the definition of done is when you stop spending money to build software. And what I'm suggesting is that that's not the way anybody does it in Silicon Valley. Nobody. Everybody realizes that you need to continuously improve your products, because the minute you stop improving them, technical debt starts to grow, and the faster technology advances, the faster your technical debt grows. So I think Kevin brought up a really interesting point when he says this is about the way we allocate funds, because if we don't change the way we allocate funds, then the way we allocate funds will force us into building systems that more quickly become legacy. There are really clear and easy ways to solve that problem, but it's an agreement that has to take place between the software engineering folks and the way they build software, the product management folks and their view of product, and the accounting folks. And we need to give the accounting folks a different way to hold us accountable than the waterfall way that says, this phase is done, this phase is done, this phase is done, now you're done, because that'll never work.
So could I ask a question?
Sure.
It seems to me that the continuous improvement norm that we see in the private sector is largely driven by supply side factors, in the sense that technical progress is possible, and so it happens, and then people deploy it because it's a competitive environment. But in the government, shouldn't there be some consideration of how fast your needs for satisfying service volumes? Of course, service volume grows as the population grows, but maybe once the method of operating where you start and then you're done at some point happens because you don't have a need for increasing your throughput capacity as rapidly as might be the case in the private sector. So is there a difference in the way the government should be looking at modernization, at least the pace of modernization that it should strive for compared to the private sector?
I think it's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure that I don't know if I'm going to give you a great answer, because I think that the devil's in the details on that one. But what I would say is this: you know, the Silicon Valley companies are profit driven. They don't just go deploy technology for technology's sake by any stretch of the imagination. So they deploy a new technology because they believe that it's going to allow them to add features that are going to delight their customers, and that delight is going to turn into business. Now, I would argue that the government probably could be a little bit more delightful as well, right? And isn't so much. The other thing is, because the commercial businesses are profit driven, then they're always looking for an edge to reduce their costs, even if it doesn't add new features. So the drive to the cloud, driven very much by guys like Google and Amazon, that the drive to the cloud is driven by the fact that they recognize that they can significantly reduce their costs by having more effective utilization of infrastructure. And cloud comes from that desire. And clearly the government has those same desires to reduce their costs in infrastructure. So while I imagine that there are some folks that just make changes for change's sake, because maybe, every once in a while you'll see some vendors come out with a new color scheme on their website just because change is attractive to some people. I don't think that really is what the bulk of this is about. I think the bulk of this is about, wow, look, we could use these new machine learning techniques to add some significantly new capabilities that make it so much easier to use our website, or that makes our website so much more intelligent in suggesting what the next step ought to be, that those kinds of technologies are attractive to the customer, but the public is government's customer, and we need to be more attractive to them. One real life story from Social Security. I mentioned this disability case processing system. When I first got started in the project, I went out and survey. I went to several field offices and I talked to a bunch of people out there, and they all sort of told me the same story, and that is that the systems required you to memorize so much information. There was so little intelligence in the system to support the Social Security employees that use those systems to face the public. There was so little intelligence in those things that that the employees had to memorize volumes of information. And what I was told over and over again was that if they brought in a brand new employee, that it took 6 months before they could even let that employee do a case by themselves. And it took 2 years before you would consider an employee to be a journeyman, because it took 2 years to memorize all of this information. Furthermore, the look and feel of the legacy front end was so unfamiliar to anybody that you would ever hire these days that it just made the problem all that much harder. When we deployed the new system, which was built by those end users, so they directed us to build in the intelligence that wasn't in the other system. And when we built it using modern user interfaces, so that people could sit down and just intuitively find their way around it, we found that the number of hours of training to get started was, for a journeyman, was 0. Really, honestly, no training was necessary. We put experienced field people in front of this new user interface, and they were able to use it right out of the box, just like what happens when you download a new app on your laptop or your phone. You don't go to a class. And we found that these people were able to get up to speed so much faster, and their job satisfaction was so much greater because they were comfortable with the tool that they were using with, that all of these things added up to be really a significant benefit to the SSA that maybe wasn't fully appreciated when we started. I hope that answers at least part of your question.
Sure, no, thank you. I don't want to take too much time.
That was a
That's-
great
Can
question.
continue there.
I'd also
Yeah,
I also want to jump in and note that a tangent that hopefully we hear again and again here is that when you modernize a system, you don't necessarily save money, right? And that doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. As Rob was just saying, there's a lot of ancillary benefits. There's a lot of extra things that you don't factor in that, that example of, you don't need to train your users is something that you can't really quantify when you're planning to modernize the system. But all of your users are going to get better experiences. Your staff are going to be able to do more with less. So there's ripple effects to the organization that don't necessarily get factored in when you do the initial cost benefit analysis. So, but again, just because a system modernization isn't going to save money doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. There's a lot of other things that should come into play when you're making that decision.
Well, and Kevin, let me focus on that for a minute, have both of you focus on that for a minute, because that does seem to be the implicit assumption of Congress, that they expect that if there's going to be modernization, it's going to save money. And what you're saying is we really need to reorient policymakers thinking about that. Is that a fair way to?
So I'd shade that and say that many of the policymakers would like us to take care of the low-hanging fruit, where if we modernize it, it will save money, because there are instances where that will happen. But the congressional staff actually absolutely understand that it's more nuanced than that. But since Congress is hyper focused on money and cost savings, anything that can save money, they really want the agencies to do that. And the MGT Act, which was passed in 2016 or 2017, established two main avenues for agencies to do that. It allowed agencies to set up working capital funds internal to the agency where they could put any resulting cost savings. They could transfer money into those working capital funds and then use that money for later modernizations or cybersecurity. And they also set up this Central Technology Modernization Fund, which is housed at GSA, and has been in the news to a huge extent recently, just because in the most recent COVID bills, it got $8 billion, B with billion, to help agencies modernize their systems. Now, that central fund, you can almost think of it as a lending bank where agencies apply for funds to supplement what they get in their appropriations, and this central fund reviews their applications, tries to make sure that we're being the best stewards of taxpayer money, and lends the money out with the understanding that they will be paid back. They've recently loosened up those repayment rules a little bit. It's not clear exactly how much it will be loosened, but they've said that around cybersecurity related issues, especially in light of the SolarWinds hack and the pipeline hack of the past few weeks, that they really want to allow agencies to focus on cybersecurity as they focus on modernizations as well.
Very, very well. Jagadish, thank you for that question. And those were very informative answers. Let me open it up to Jagadish, if you have others or other members on staff of the board, if you have questions, please feel free to jump in. If not, I have plenty of other questions. But
none here, Nancy.
say okay. So, and do we have yet any from the public or not yet?
So Nancy, I'm going to jump in real quick, and it speaks to the issue that Kevin just brought up, the TMF fund. And I know you may not be able to say too much about it, but what we've heard recently is something that you alluded to earlier, Kevin, in that, it's difficult to anticipate what future appropriations will be. And so I think that's part of the rationale behind some of the concern that was expressed in terms of TMF being set up as sort of a lending program, if you will, and how that may inhibit the ability for agencies to take advantage of those funds. So what are your any other thoughts about that?
So the TMF is an interesting alternate funding mechanism. It's not going to work in every case. It's also, frankly, prior to this huge influx of cash, it wasn't receiving a lot of money on an annual basis. So I think it was like initially funded to the tune of $100 million, but then each successive year it's gotten about 25. And I'm going to trigger Rob here in a second. But that amount of funding really only lets you focus on a certain tier of systems. If you have $25 million a year, that's in government money, not a ton. And here we go, Rob. So one of the systems that we identified in the report was a treasury system. The annual operating costs of this system were to the tune of about $15 million. That includes both operations and labor. And the government reported that it would cost $1.6 billion to modernize. So one, that's a heck of a lot of money. Two, the TMF, if they're getting $25 million a year, they're not going to be able to touch anything of that scope, right? So the biggest, most important and critical systems in the government that are going to take a lot of money to modernize, the TMF can't touch. So it will be interesting to see what they do with the $1 billion. But again, just because you're modernizing doesn't mean you're saving money. So exactly to your point, there are some types of modernizations that won't even be interested in applying because it won't save us money. That doesn't mean we shouldn't do it. But again, the appropriations process can be a hindrance, and the additional flexibilities given by the TMF and potentially the working capital funds are potentially an avenue that agencies should at least consider exploring.
So of course, Kevin knew exactly where he was steering me in that sense. So I want to say two things. One is, in the Silicon Valley, there's no such thing as a software startup that spends $100 million to build software before they get a product out. There's no such thing. It's never happened. Never. It's interesting if you go back and look at how much money Facebook spent on software development before they went public with almost 1 billion concurrent users. It's $10 million. So, these $1 billion estimates are just so completely out of sync by 2 orders of magnitude or more with the reality of what it takes to build modern software, that it's just a bit crazy to me. This disability case processing system that we built at SSA, at the time that I became the CIO, we had burnt $300 million. We had nothing to show for it. We went through an exercise to give the vendor a chance to fix the issues. And after some number of tries, it became really clear that what they had built was just not ever going to work. And so we shut it down and started from scratch. So let's imagine that this I'm going to make up a number, and let's imagine that the $300 million project was going to cost another $300 million to get right if we'd have done it the old school way. So it would have been a $600 million project. I think that it was budgeted for $500 million or something. And 3 years later, we delivered a brand new disability case processing system for around $60 million. And we delivered a first increment of that disability case processing system into production in the field, actually running real life cases 14 months after we started. And we started from the coldest of cold starts. No one had ever deployed in the cloud. We deployed in the cloud. We used a new modern programming language called Node.js, and neither the vendors, neither the contractors nor the government employees, nobody on the team we couldn't even spell Node.js. We had to learn the programming language from scratch. And so with that complete cold start, in order to build everything, and we used agile methods, which we hadn't really ever used effectively before, and we used test-driven development, which we'd never used before, blah, 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 blah. Everything was modern and new. And even with that cold start, we got the entire thing done. Unfortunately, I think done and now dusted. It's now considered a project that is in maintenance mode. It's no longer in product development mode. But $60 million. That probably represented, if you look at what Social Security is, two giant systems, disability and SSI, this was probably represented maybe 1/3 to 1/5 of the disability software portfolio. Let's just go with let's say 1/5. So that would be about 1/6 of the entire software portfolio for Social Security for $60 million. So we could rewrite the whole thing for probably 5 to 10 times $60 million. So that when
should
you
we
look,
consider that? Should we consider that a bid, Rob?
hey, yeah, I'll tell you what. If you guys would give me that bid, I'll go find somebody and we'll bid it and we'll do it. I really believe it. I mean, I really believe it. Honestly, I really honestly believe that the numbers that, by the way, when I started at Social Security and I asked them what they thought it was going to cost to modernize SSI, they said over $1 billion. I mean, it's just, where people's heads are at because what they think is that they're going to rebuild it using the same approaches and tools that they originally built it with. And if you did that, it probably is billions of dollars.
I want to jump in here and highlight one critical part.
Please,
Rob's
but I have
story.
one more really important thing I want to bring up.
So Rob canceling a $300 million program is incredibly difficult for federal IT leaders to do. I can only imagine how many people were, to not mince words, really pissed off by that decision. That's a really, really hard thing to do in government, where you move up when you don't rock the boat. So kudos to Rob. We need more leaders like that willing to take that risk. And part of the reason that the acronym for the big private sector companies is FANG: Facebook, Amazon, Apple, Netflix, and Google, right? So those big companies are not afraid to fail. Government, it's anathema to fail. You cannot fail. So kudos to Rob and other leaders like him who are willing to take that risk and force the government to be better.
Yeah, I had an amazing team who basically was willing to not just rock the boat, but fall over and get wet and then climb back in. So, but I want to say one other thing, because twice now, what's come up is this idea that the IT budget that you have varies from year to year. And that's probably a reality that never goes away. Again, one of the things that's really interesting is if you use the old school systems development lifecycle, which tend to label waterfall, you build a giant project and you lay it all out in advance as if you really could ever figure out exactly what it was going to take 3 years from now in order to get something done, and pretend that these things that you lay off in advance and you build this giant Microsoft project plan, and then you give it to the auditors and the accountants, and they basically hold you to it as if you could really know how many hours of programming you were going to spend on this thing 3 years out that you just have, vague ideas about. And the problem is that the project that you build when you use that method, the project is monolithic and it's not flexible, or to use the word that I need to get to, it's not agile. Now, if I built the exact same thing with a project plan and a development program and team that was agile, what you'd end up doing is you would say, I've got so many people that represent the business, and then I'm going to build a series of Scrum teams to fill up my budget. And let's just imagine I'm going to build 10 Scrum teams of 6 people a piece. So I have 60 developers on this thing. Well, if the next year your budget gets cut, you basically just put away 2 of those Scrum teams. And so now you only have 4 Scrum teams, and your velocity is reduced by 33%. So you're not building stuff as fast, but there's absolutely no impact on the project at all, other than it slows down a little bit. And if you get a little bit more money, you add those teams back and a couple of more, and now you get more velocity. And it has no impact whatsoever on the way you're running the project. The whole process doesn't change at all, except for now you have more velocity. So part of the beauty of Agile is that what you're trying to do is put together teams and maximize the velocity. But if you have to cut the teams back, then you just cut the teams back. And if sometime later you get more money, you add it back in and you build more teams. And so agility, the part of the agility you get from the Agile methodology is the agility to really, with no friction whatsoever, change the size of the team based upon what you have to invest.
Oh, I have so many avenues I want to pursue, but I think we've got some questions that have now been submitted from the public. So Claire, why don't we turn to those? So, because they're obviously, you're stimulating lots of ideas and thoughts.
Great, thank you, Nancy. So the first question is, where in government rules or regulations is there a requirement for waterfall? Isn't the real question how to get return on investment from modernizing business practices?
So there is no requirement in government rules and regulations to do waterfall. In fact, the government has been pushing more and more to do Agile-like, to just throw out a slew of keywords or buzzwords. Agile is one, iterative, incremental, DevSecOps. There's a whole slew of these new, more modern development methodologies that basically focus on, well, similar to the old adage, how to eat an elephant one bite at a time. You just go slow and take off little chunks right as you go. And to Rob's point, that's how you do it. You do these little development chunks and you put out usable products and usable functionalities so that you can get reactions from your users earlier, rather than waiting 3 years and hundreds of millions of dollars and then building something and finding out, oh, we really should have done it this other way, but we didn't get any input along the way.
So I agree with everything Kevin just said there, and I would add to your part of the question that's about the business side. I mean, absolutely, part of the problem that we have in modernization in the government is that we look at these giant monolithic systems. I mean, I think Social Security Administration has 60 million lines of COBOL and about 7 million lines of assembler language that run their core systems. We look at these giant things and we go, oh, we can't rewrite 60 million lines. So let's see if we can pull a module out and just modernize that, and then pull another module out and another module out and another module out. But it turns out that if you take that approach, first off, you have to have modules that are clean enough that you can rewrite them without having the places that module touches all of the other gunk. The integration of the modern module into all the gunky modules can cost more and induce more technical risk than if you just threw the whole thing out. You can't throw the whole thing out because it's too, you can't eat the elephant all in one bite. And so the effective way that we did this with the disability case processing system was that we actually focused on business processes and we modernized the simplest case first, end to end, and put it in production. And then we took the next several case types that were a little bit more complicated, and we modernized those and put them in production. And so we used Agile to build new technology, but it was driven always by the business, not by the IT organization. And the business drove us to focus on different case types, not on modules in a technical architecture.
To add another government example, that's similar to how the IRS started electronically processing their tax returns. Rather than trying to do everything all at the same time, they focused on the 1040EZ, the easiest of tax return forms, and those were the first ones that they electronically processed that first year. They just did a handful of them, and then the next year they added on another type of form, and they just kept on taking little bites And that's how we now have, I won't say modern electronic tax processing, but we do have, electronic tax processing instead of people reviewing everything by hand.
And I really want to drill down to that whole concept that you're talking about and how it applies to what's going on with current SSA modernization. But why don't we take one more question from the public, because I think we're getting lots of questions. So the sort of balance between keeping a train of thought going and also bringing in what other people are talking about. So Claire, you want to hit us with one more question?
Sure. In terms of readiness to execute a modernization program of the scale SSA needs, looking at the strategies, the people, the processes, governance structure, and tools, how would you assess SSA's readiness today?
Well, and that's a nice transition to really talking about SSA.
So look, I mean, I've been away long enough now that I couldn't even guess about what their readiness is today. But what I will say is that so SSA is a little bit different than most agencies and departments in the federal government in that, at least when I was there, and I think this probably still holds, that something like 60 to 70% of all of the hours spent on IT were hours spent by federal employees, and only about 30% of the hours were spent by contractors. And that is a really unique advantage, because the SSA staff is really remarkably, IT staff, remarkably competent. I mean, really remarkably competent. I was so pleased. And now, to be fair, in that big competent staff, were a bunch of people that had competence in legacy software systems and were interested in staying and applying that competence and staying in legacy software systems. And I think that that's just fine. I have no problem with that at all. I mean, those legacy things are going to be around, they'll be here when I'm dead and gone, right? And there were other people that were really, really interested in learning new stuff. And so, when we pulled the teams of the people kind of excited about learning new stuff and doing something modern together with the people that were doing legacy stuff who understood the old systems, we had really fantastic collaborative sessions about how we might take bites out of the elephant. And we frankly spent lots and lots of time trying to figure out how to take technological bites out of the elephant as opposed to business process bites out of the elephant, and only sort of late in the game realized that there were no bite-sized chunks when you looked at it from the technology side. So I think that there's some trepidation for sure, because as Kevin said earlier, there's taking risk isn't the first instinct of people in any large organization. By the way, that's not a government statement. People don't want to take risk in large commercial corporations either, really. So I think there's some worry about the readiness of this stuff, but I think if you put together a plan and you showed that the plan was consistent with how you were successful with DCPS, or consistent with how some other government agency was successful in modernization, to be fair, I think if you put that plan together and you got the funding, and the funding itself wasn't so risky that you worried that if somehow it slowed down and it failed or it cost too much, that you would get to the point where you owed this fund back more money than you had in your IT budget for 5 years, right? I think if you could get the funding and you could get a plan, I actually think that there are lots of people at SSA that understand that the same advances that we were able to provide to the caseworkers for disability that use the new DCPS system, that we could provide those same advances to all of the other field employees at SSA who really are the operations people that do the real work, right?
You know, you're both, I love these images for a layperson like me. You know, the idea of you can't eat an elephant in one bite, and the other one that I often hear is it's like updating a plane in mid-flight, you know, that kind of thing. So the question is, how do you decide and how do you identify and prioritize the bites that you take, the systems needing? And as part of that, I'd really love, Rob, for you to, and maybe Kevin will start, but for Rob, for you to talk about your experience with the disability case processing system, lessons learned, how that, I mean, you started to touch on that, but I think for a lot of people, they don't really know what that is, how that came about. So any just sort of thoughts about, as SSA thinks about, obviously there are people over there who have to make these decisions about which bites to take in what order.
So there are several things that agencies should be thinking about. First, I'm going to go back to the report that's cited in chat. We identified 4 consequences of not modernizing. So you got security risks, mission needs, staffing, and increased costs. So those are all kind of, hey, if you don't modernize, you may face increased security risks. Basically, if you're not updating and using the latest versions of software, or if the vendor no longer supports your software, you potentially could face increased security risks. You may not be meeting your mission needs. You may not have the staff capable of maintaining those legacy systems, and you may face increased costs to address any of those earlier 3. So when you're modernizing, we identified 4 things that, and this is not us doing it, this is based on us talking to legacy and modernization experts across the government. We identified 4 things that they basically told us. So consider your risks, consider how critical the system is, how much it's going to cost, and what the performance of your current system and the potential modern system is going to be. Rob, you want to jump in? And
sure. I mean, any of the folks that work with me at Social Security have heard me say this goofy thing I'm about to say, and so when they hear this start, they'll all probably groan. But you know, one of the problems with prioritizing how you take bites out of the elephant is that can become analysis paralysis, because the problem is so big and so difficult. And so the silly thing that I used to say to everybody is, look, we have to eat the entire elephant. Why are we spending so much time arguing over where to take the first bite? Right? So, I mean, I know that abuses that metaphor, but so it goes. I'll say a couple of things about the eating the elephant thing, but I'm going to say some things about what is definitely not what you should be spending your time on. One thing is, should not be spending your time agonizing over the programming language that you're going to use or the database management system that you're going to use. All of those technical things in the big scheme of things just don't matter. With DCPS, for reasons that had to do with proving that we could do something completely fresh, we picked a programming language that nobody knew and a database management system that had never been deployed before. And we deployed all of those in the cloud, which had never been done before, because we wanted to prove that back to the readiness thing, that the staff of the Social Security Administration was capable of just starting from scratch with brand new, extremely modern tools and to pull it off. So it was an important learning just to show people that they could do that stuff. But it's not, the programming language isn't the issue. I don't even care. Honestly, you know, there probably are some things that are important. For example, you know, we've talked about cloud already. You know, clearly the target architecture, if we're building something modern, needs to be a cloud-based thing. I would argue that probably that means that, you know, in today's day, we should be architecting, you know, with containers and doing something a little bit more modern than was the state of the art for DCPS. And so there's some architectural things that I think are kind of givens. But once you decide those things, then all the other stuff you should just not agonize over. Friggin' flip a coin, right? I mean, I wouldn't even care if we rewrote the things in COBOL, as long as you could deploy COBOL scalable in the cloud, in a cloud native application, which you really can't do, right? But it's not about COBOL. COBOL is just another programming language. There's nothing wrong with COBOL. There's probably reasons that you wouldn't, that if you're going to be cloud native, you might not want to deploy, you might want to deploy on the cheapest infrastructure you can, not on, one of the most expensive infrastructures you can. But all of these things are decisions you should make in a week. There are several places where you can go see the relative popularity of programming languages and the relative popularity of database management systems. And what I would say is you should probably go pick something that's in the top 5 or 10 programming languages or databases in the commercial world. And you should pick something that is increasing in popularity, not something that's decreasing in popularity. And you should be able to get together and make that decision, database and programming language, in a week. It's just not something you should agonize over, because it's just not going to be a giant mistake if you pick Python instead of Node.js, or if you decide you're going to stick with Java, which, by the way, is a 30-year-old programming language, right? No, but it's okay. It doesn't matter. Don't agonize over those things. Pick something that is popular, that it's easy to hire programmers that know it, that's on the rise in popularity, probably that's not something that you can look each other in the eye and say, I have a high degree of confidence that this programming language is still going to be in the top 10 list in 10 years or 15 years, right? So you wouldn't want to pick some weird niche thing. You might want to be careful about proprietary things that may come and go. But be careful doesn't mean don't pick them, just means be careful.
I mean, this is, again, as a layperson, what I, and I'm sure other lay people hear all the time is, oh, this language is so old, they don't even train anybody in it. And I found that really a refreshing response. And also, I think, Kevin, you said when we were talking about this in our planning session, that in some circumstances, COBOL may have advantages, so that it's not just the age of the language but Kevin, let me have you jump in.
So I defer to Rob on specific advantages and disadvantages of the legacy systems. He has worked absolutely more with this kind of stuff than I have. But I believe we were talking about Fortran, which has very, very specific benefits for scientific and math and engineering related basically missions. And I think NASA has said that Fortran is what's going to get us to Mars. So the takeaway from this is, just because something's old doesn't mean it's broken or not worthwhile. Hooray. But to what Rob was saying, just be familiar with what you're picking, why you're going to pick it, and then make the decision and start working.
Nancy?
Yes.
This is Kim. I have a question.
Go ahead.
Welcome, Kevin and Rob. Kim Hildred, Chair of the Board. Thank you so much for being here, number one. Number two, I wanted to talk a little, to follow through on a couple things that have been said. I've been around a long time with SSA, and I think clearly they're making a lot of progress. I think Rob rightly points out, I think Agile began under his leadership, and SSA has truly embraced it, which is terrific. DCPS is certainly an achievement. One could argue about the success of its implementation, but we won't go there for now. I think SSA has really made a lot of progress, probably starting with Rob, but in terms of the systems people working with the business process folks and really focusing on business processes. And I think most importantly, they are very much now moving to an environment where they're focused on the customer experience and working on identifying, what delights the American public and thinking about their future via that role and the foundational support that their system can be. But I wanted you to talk, perhaps, Kevin, about as you work with other federal agencies, both you and Rob talked about the importance of staying current. What's the formula or what is it that works in terms of how a big federal agency like Social Security is able, like structurally, how can they stay on top of what's going on in terms of what's current? Because we know in software things are changing all the time. So how does an agency stay current? How, is it the use of the RFI process? How do they stay current on that? And, and how do their contracting staff stay current on a lot of these things so that they're able to support the agency in getting what it needs?
So I don't know that I have a good answer that's going to fully address that question, just because GAO hasn't quite looked at that work. I would note, however, that SSA isn't necessarily amongst the worst. I don't know. Well, SSA structurally does have one advantage in that it is not a highly federated organization. SSA's CIO does have relatively complete control over everything that is plugged into its network. Contrast that with the Department of Agriculture, which has myriad sub-bureaus and components. Commerce is the same way, or heavens forbid, DoD with, basically DoD. I think if you look at its annual expenditures, is the 13th, somewhere in the top 20 countries in the world in terms of how much it spends. So its IT is just on a whole nother level. But the fact that everything is relatively contained within SSA does lend it an advantage that many other agencies don't have. So I think that works in its favor. To the base question, it's difficult staying on top of it, right? You need to make sure that your contracting staff are, up to date, trained on what the latest flexibilities are, what they can use to acquire and to implement things using these new methodologies, which is in some cases hard. Now, since SSA has already completed a lot of the shift to Agile, I would hope that many of their contracting staff have that knowledge built into the organization. So again, an advantage for SSA that others may not have. But hiring the right people, I think, is part of the key. As we talked about earlier, the decision that Rob made to cut off a program that had already spent $300 million. We need leaders like that.
So great, really interesting questions, Kim. I'll say a couple things that will be unique because I do that sometimes. One thing that became really apparent is, the contractors in the Beltway that we have access to, they have the skills that we pay them to have. So if we pay our contractors to be COBOL programmers, then when we go look for somebody to be a Node.js programmer, they're not there. And if we pay our programmers, if we pay our contractors to do waterfall projects and not do Agile projects, then when we try to find people that really know and have actually used Agile to do big projects, they're not going to be there. And so there's a chicken and egg thing that goes on that I don't blame the contractors for at all. Kevin said a minute ago, you just got to get started. I think that you just got to get started. You just got to go try to do some stuff, and you need to think about how would they do this in Silicon Valley, and just try to do it that way. Because if you don't start doing that, then your staff and the contracting staff that you have to draw upon will have the same old skills, and they won't really progress. The Fortran thing is interesting. Fortran is a really effective language for science, but with that said, if you went to Silicon Valley where there's lots of science going on in machine learning and stuff like that, nobody's writing those algorithms in Fortran, because there are other languages like the math library in Python and stuff like that that are now just as good or better. The reason that Fortran is going to get us to Mars is because NASA's got a whole bunch of people that know Fortran, and they train people in Fortran behind them, and the contractors that they hire know Fortran. And so it's totally the right decision for NASA to pick Fortran, but they're not picking Fortran because it's the best possible modern language to go forward. It's because that's the skills that they have available. And you have to manage that trade-off. The second thing I'll say is there is a fundamental problem around modernizing really old legacy systems, because really old legacy systems are all batch processing at the core. And modern systems do stuff in real time. So you can go sit down today and sign up for health insurance with an application process that is not that different than signing up for healthcare benefits in the federal space. Or you can, if you've already signed up, log in and ask for, open a case because you have a disability that your insurance covers. And you can go online and click all the buttons, and when you're done, you hit enter, and it's approved or disapproved in real time. Certainly, you can do that with all kinds of insurance things, and there's no way to get there as long as the core system is a batch system. The best you could ever do is get it overnight. And so the modernization problem, if we really want to provide service to the public that's the kind of instantaneous capability that we see in commercial products, the only way we're going to do that is to rewrite the core. And I said that the core is 60 million lines of COBOL and 7 million lines of assembler language, something like that, at Social Security. And so the question is the count of COBOL and assembler language at Social Security going up or going down over time? If it's not going down, we're not modernizing.
Hey, Nancy.
And then I'm sorry, one last thing, and you asked about how to stay current.
Mhm.
It's really weird. I hate to say this because it becomes such a showstopper, but the reality is there has to be a cultural change. And the reason it's a cultural change is because in Silicon Valley, nobody that's a programmer in Silicon Valley, nobody, I mean, seriously, nobody, maybe there's some Java programmers, but outside of Java programmers, no programmer in Silicon Valley believes that the programming language that they're an expert in today is going to be the only programming language they ever learn for the rest of their career. I mean, really nobody. Nobody believes the database management system that they built the last application in is the only database management system that's ever going to be used in their corporation for all time. And so the reality is there is this culture of constantly looking around for the new stuff and learning it and using the fact that you've learned this to be an advantage and accelerate your career. And until we can get a culture going where people are constantly, without being directed, looking around for new cool technology that they can bring and apply to solve the business problem in a more effective way, until that just becomes an organic activity, it will be hard to stay current.
This has links to Jagadish's earlier question, though, or comment on supply and demand. The government doesn't face the same kinds of pressures to continuously modernize and continuously improve. I'm not disagreeing with Rob's point that we need more of that, but it's going to be part of the problem in motivating the government to move towards that kind of paradigm.
So if I may, Nancy.
Please do.
I had a question too, but why don't you go Jagadish and then Bob? Go ahead.
So based on your conversation, it occurs to me that modernizing has more dimensions than just applicable to IT system modernization. Because part of your comments was not only did you look at new programming languages, but you also looked at how to organize the effort. what types of arrangements and subdivisions, and if I may, parallel processes that you deployed by the way you divvied up your teams to make them more flexible and agile, as you say. The agile method is something we've also adopted in where I work at Wharton. Is there scope at SSA to modernize the way they conduct even their business operations by using a different method of organizing the human component of what it takes to get throughput? And how broadly applicable is this new way of organizing how work is done?
That's a great question. I don't think that I have, certainly not current, but I mean, it would be an interesting question to ask the operations people at Social Security. So great question.
I'd like to follow up with a question. This is just remarkably interesting. Thank you. Yesterday, we had a panel that was talking about lessons learned from the COVID period. And one of the things that was brought up had to do with applications for SSI that indicated that people who have the level of disability that would prompt them to apply for SSI have difficulty using accessing SSA through technology, and that not being able to have go to a brick and mortar site has really decreased the volume of applications for that particular group. And that leads one to think that in doing modernization of IT, that it's going to be very important to reach certain populations that are termed vulnerable. I don't know if that's the right term or not, but people who have difficulty navigating technology, that being able to make those systems more usable and open to them or to folks who are helping them. So this is one component. It seems to me, getting back to the elephant dining image, that is a very important component in terms of modernization and reform to make these systems more accessible. So where does that plug in to the myriad of factors that you have to juggle in doing modernization?
You know, in every user interface, you know, what you strive for is to only ask for the information that you absolutely need, so that you're not, there's nothing extraneous. And then what you're striving for after that is to find as many different ways that you can capture that information from the end user in a way that works for the end user. And so, you know, there's so much amazing off-the-shelf technology today that things that are coming out where you could actually plug something in. By the way, you know, R&D quality stuff that can read sign language. You can plug things in that are beginning to be able to read lips. These things are probably not, they may not be ready for prime time now, but you can see that this is where it's going. You can see that that with machine learning additions to the user interface, that you can start to, in the same way that in Google starts to actually fill out the word that you're typing as you're typing it, though in real time, you can use those kinds of capabilities to anticipate the questions that people are asking and make it much easier for people to key things in and I mean, dramatically reduce the amount of effort to put information in. So I think this goes to the point of continuous improvement. As these technologies mature, some of the ones I just mentioned are, some of them are coming. As those technologies mature, we need to be continuously improving our applications so that these disabled people or people with other handicaps or people that just aren't computer literate, those people have the same ability to enter the information as anybody else does. You know, one of the things that I did towards the end of the Social Security thing was we pulled together a bunch of business people, only a couple of IT people, and we basically tried to help them understand completely far out things that could be done relatively easy, but we wanted to understand what the business guys thought were the gaps that we might do. And some interesting things came out, like one of the really big problems they have is if you're an elderly disabled person and you have to every once in a while go back into the doctor to be evaluated to ensure that the disability that you're being paid for, you still have that disability. One of the biggest problems they have is just getting that person into the doctor and then back home again. Because that person's got to somehow find a ride. And I kind of looked at him and I said, well, why wouldn't you just put a button on the caseworker's screen that they could click to deploy an Uber to go pick them up, and click and give the doctor a button to click an Uber to send them back home? It costs $5 each way for an Uber, and the $10 it would cost SSA to make that happen would save an order of magnitude or more in cost in what we currently spend trying to figure out how to get people there and then dinging them for their disability when they can't make it and all that kind of stuff. So I just think that that it goes back to this continuous improvement thing. All of those problems are solvable. The technologies we have to solve them are continuously advancing and continuously improving. And we have to build systems that are capable of extending continuously as these new technologies become available to solve the very problems you're bringing up, Bob.
Just to follow up, one of the things I've found as someone who uses technology regularly is that the private market is always expecting me to adapt to its changes and to train myself to use them. And so when these new apps appear or modifications to the apps appear, there isn't a long instruction manual as to how to use them. I'm sort of expected to adapt, whereas that may not work very well for certain populations who, once they've mastered or learned how to use a particular access route, just want to depend upon that to keep going forward. And so it seems that particularly in the disability realm, where it's recognized that people have unique needs, that they're different, that each person is a little bit different, it's hard to standardize and then modify, whereas in the private market, that seems to be the model.
Change is a challenge for some people, and I don't mean that in a demeaning way at all, right? And but the answer can't be, so don't change.
Right.
So
Kevin, if you want to jump in, or else Claire, why don't we bring in a question from the public?
Great. In yesterday's hearing, social workers and scientists talked about the gap in applicants and beneficiaries' ability to use technology because of lack of accessibility. Don't the legacy systems automate legacy processes? And if so, how should the modernization address citizen service needs for simpler, more responsive case management practices, including multiple government programs usually supporting the beneficiary?
This is kind of to Rob's earlier point about batch processing and responsiveness of our applications. If all we're doing is changing the front end to beat the elephant metaphor to death, if all you're doing is changing the front end, you're just slapping lipstick on the elephant and you're not changing what's underneath. You need to address the core issues that would allow your systems to become more responsive to the users.
I think that I think the other thing that I would say around that question is, you know, one of the complaints that private industry gets in spades is the complaint that says, why do you keep asking me for the same information over and over and over again? You have my address and social security number or whatever it is that you have from me, you have that. And now I'm in a different part of your business and you're asking me for it again. And then when I go to another part of your business, you're asking for me it again. And I think part of this question is, why is it that the government can't consolidate information? And so that you know, every time I go to a government site, I don't have to enter it over and over and over again. And I do believe that there are really solid technologies available, labeled under the title of customer information systems, that would allow the government to have a profile of information about people that are doing business with the government, that there's ways to build those things so that the information is secure and only visible by the government agencies that are allowed to see it. I think it would be a remarkable achievement if the federal government were able to take that on, but it's probably so remarkable that pigs will fly first.
I'd also note that there are really, really valid concerns about that kind of data aggregation about citizens related to Big Brother watching over you and privacy and the like that would really, really need to be addressed beforehand. SSA in particular has very, very rigid constraints on who it can share information with and why and when, and there need to be very, very specific agreements in place. So that may not be a decision that can be made in a week, but I agree that the government could do more to make sure that every damn website you go to isn't asking for you to log in again.
And Claire, you want to have one more question and then we'll turn to our last set of topics.
By 2030, there will be a global shortage of more than 85 million tech workers, representing 8.5 trillion in lost annual revenue, according to management consultant firm Korn Ferry, based in Los Angeles. Companies are paying more, they're hiring more, but there's still a shortage of high-skilled tech workers. What has been SSA's experience with the aforementioned when it comes to the labor needed to modernize their legacy systems?
I'll say two things about that. One is a great story that was a surprise to me and I think everybody else. But you know, there's this sort of meme that floats around in the Beltway that is that it's impossible for the federal government to hire competent technology workers because they'll all go to private industry where they can make more money. And the interesting real life experience was that I was given permission while I was there to hire 100 new IT people and train them to be programmers to address this very thing that were brought up. And when we posted the job openings for 100 people, we got 1,000 applications from our contractors who wanted to become federal employees. So so I'd like to, you know, just take a quick aside and try to put a hole in the myth that you can't hire competent federal IT workers because you don't pay enough. But the other side of that thing is because everybody's beginning to recognize that the Korn Ferry issue is real. there's all kinds of really interesting boot camp concepts that basically allow you to go into a immersive, intensive 30 to 60 to 90 day boot camp. And when you come out of that boot camp, let's say 60 days, you are a competent newbie programmer, competent enough that you could be assigned a job to go write code and you'd be capable of doing it. You have a breadth of experience. And so while we were at Social Security, and when I had this permission to hire people, we contracted with a company who built a boot camp for us, and we tried to accelerate the training to see if we could, get ahead of this problem that has just been, I think, properly identified. So, I mean, the numbers are daunting, but I think that the way you solve the problem is by getting out in front of it and hiring more people. By the way, the contractors probably have to hire more people as well, and getting them trained up in a faster, more effective way than we've used in the past. And then I think the last bit is that there's lots and lots of tooling that goes on that is being built, and you can see new stuff. Slack is brand new, extremely effective tool. GitHub is relatively new. There's a bunch of agile tooling that continues to improve. And so I think that there's a giant amount of effort in place. There's a thing called low code and no code programming languages that have their place. There's a bunch of stuff going on to address that problem by making it easier to train programmers and make them be more effective faster. And so I think all of those things have to come to bear to solve the problem.
Well, let me at this point bring in some other issues, but not cut off anything we've already said. And I'm sure there are going to be lots and lots of comments and questions on what we've already talked about. But we've talked about the private sector and what we can learn from the private sector, but in some ways, the federal government, of course, is sui generis. Nobody else flies to Mars. Well, I guess Tesla maybe at some point, but normally not. And that Congress is the oversight, but they don't really have the expertise. And they're concerned about it, but they can't really focus on it. They don't seem to focus on it unless something bad happens. If there's a lot of money spent, or there's some kind of what can be seen as a problem that materializes. So, Rob, you started to touch about objective when you were talking about the number of lines of COBOL. But are there that and other ways of objectively monitoring and measuring ongoing progress? And also, Kevin, you talked about culture and the culture, what the culture should be and needs to be. Are there ways to incentivize to get the kind of culture that you think is important to have? So let me just throw that out as to take where you want to take. So Rob, do you want to start with
Sure.
progress?
Yeah. If you just think about IT, I mean, if you think about the business of Social Security or of any other agency, it would be broader. But if you just think about IT, I think that there's sort of two major functions. One is software development and maintenance. And the other one is operations and infrastructure. And so if you ask yourself, what are the key performance indicators for the software development organization? I would say that it is, I'm going to say three things, but the last one's really hard. Clearly, I mean, every month at Social Security, we run a report. The report says, here's how many lines of code we have in production, and here's the languages that the code is written in, and the systems that the code is associated with. And I think it's probably a bit of a no-brainer to suggest that if you're modernizing, the number of lines of code written in COBOL and deployed in COBOL needs to be going down. You might argue it should go down really fast, or you might argue it's going to go down slow, but clearly it should be going down at some reasonable pace. I think that there's the assembler language stuff definitely has to be going down. That's really scary because there's just not people around that know how to write assembler language for the mainframe anymore. I kept waiting for them to ask me to write some because they didn't have enough programmers. That would have been really scary. I think that there's some measures like that. I think that there's a measure that says, I think there's some standards that you need to set that say that all code deployed into production, I mean all code, 100% of the code in production needs to be within 1 year of the current release provided by the vendor that you get the code from. So if you're using IBM operating systems, you need to stay semi-current because they're spending lots of time trying to make those operating systems be more efficient, to fix bugs and to patch up cybersecurity holes. So technical debt can be measured by how far you are, when you buy software, how far you are away from the latest release. And then, this third one is, and then for infrastructure, I think it's really interesting. I think that there should be a really clear metric that probably should be evaluated annually or at least quarterly that says, what's the total cost you're spending on operations and infrastructure divided by the number of business transactions you do. And you would like to see the cost per transaction always going down and not, or at least not going up. And that would give you a metric that would give you the clear incentive to maybe move to the cloud and some of these other infrastructure platforms that are more cost effective. And then the third one, which is the hard one, is maybe really program specific, but I really think that there has to be some way to measure usability. How many people does it take to get how many cases processed in order to get through backlogs? And the reason I think that that's an important one and needs to be called out separately is because this comes back to the point Kevin raised much earlier, which is that there seem to be programs to fund us to save costs, but those funding things don't always help us deal with things like, it currently takes, make up a number, right? It currently takes 6 months to get from applying for this to actually get the benefit. And if you're sick or disabled, that 6 months can be desperate. And we need to find a way to measure that so that the time it takes for people from the time they apply to the time they actually receive benefits is going down. So I think that there's some ways to measure these things that are relatively simple, pretty darn objective. And if we started measuring them consistently over time, it would give SSA the justification to go ask for funding to go do maybe some more interesting stuff.
Well, and let me also ask, and for both of you, we keep talking about the work that needs to be done, but the question is, who should be doing it? There's been, over the last few decades, this idea that somehow the private sector does everything better than government, and so you've got to privatize prisons, and you've got the you know, the military with a huge amount that's now done by contracting. So the question is, to what extent work should be done by contractors, and how much in-house, and to the extent it's done by contractors, what in-house knowledge is necessary to supervise the contractors? And just to elaborate a bit, you know, federal contractors are sometimes described as beltway bandits. And as we were talking in our session, our planning session, I think, Rob, you made the point that venture capitalists they certainly have the image of being efficient and quick. Are there ways to incentivize federal contractors to emphasize speed and efficiency? Because there seems to be a built-in conflict of interest where contractors are mainly concerned about maximizing their profits. So that might be unfair to contractors. And if it is, correct me if I'm wrong, but if either of you have thoughts about that, and in terms of how to supervise the contractors and how well you think that job is being done. And Kevin, you probably see a lot of that across agencies.
So I have one thing to add to our prior discussion, to Rob's discussion of metrics and how to measure, in that I would love to see more metrics like that publicly available and transparent, so that the board, GAO, the public can continue to hold agencies accountable. Website usability is also related to the 21st Century Idea Act. So I'd throw those out there for people wanting to do more looks at it. In terms of contract types, one way to motivate would be to move away from cost plus contracts, where the government basically says, hey, we will pay your costs plus a certain amount for profit, as long as it takes, get it done. Moving away from those types of contracts into more firm fixed price contracts. That's not to say cost plus doesn't have a place. There are certain things, especially at DoD or at the cutting edge of research, where we don't know how much it's going to take, or if you're building one of the supercomputers at NNSA, we are the cutting edge, and we need to recognize that and have still a place to be able to say to contractors, look, we're willing to subsidize your research to get that done. But cost plus contracts should be very, very rare. Most of the government's work, hopefully, would be under firm fixed price. The problem with that is you need to have some really good negotiators to make sure that that truly is what's happening, and you're not giving the contractors free rein.
And I guess in the work that is getting done, that it's super.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is that if you're agile, then firm fixed price is broke, because
Right. Yeah.
So the problem is that there's just a fundamental disconnect there. So I'm not a big fan of firm fixed price. I don't know the answer to this. Contractors are for-profit businesses. That's the way they should be. I don't have any problem with that. But I think that if I was king and I could create something that I thought would improve things, if not necessarily fix it to perfection, but improve things, I just think that contractors need to be held accountable for failure. And what I mean by that is, okay, fine. So, the things overran and we approved an overrun, and then they overran again. And, they're just not getting the job done. And we shut down the project, like the one that we talked about earlier. The fact is that contractors that fail should be publicly chastised and not selected again. The problem right now is that if a contractor comes in on project A and completely goofs it up, and let's be real, it's not like these contractors goof everything up, but they goof up a lot, actually. Almost every big agency's got a horror story or two. That when you goof up, you can't get another federal contract for a while because everybody knows you goofed up. The reality is that you bid a firm fixed price contract for $100 million, you overrun and you get paid $200 million. Now you made more money. There's some press or some auditability stuff that says, it cost $200 million and the original bid was only 100. this contractor's bad, and then they win another bid at another agency the next day.
Well,
And so there's no downside to these failures. Again, I don't want to imply that they ever fail on purpose, because I know that that's not a fact, but they fail. And there's and they make money by failing. They don't lose money by failing. So the market system's kind of broke when you can't make a choice in the market outside of a small number of sort of approved federal consultancies. I know that there was an initiative that I was very supportive of that U.S. Digital Services was behind, which was trying to open up the doors to many more smaller consultancies, so that you could go get people and have the bidding process be a little bit more competitive. And I was, like I said, very supportive of that. I think USDS was spot on when they were trying to promote that kind of stuff, and maybe some of those things have to go on. So there needs to be a better, more effective market for contracting services in the federal government. And I think if we could create that more effective market, then and have it be a little bit less of an oligopoly, then the system just might fix itself.
To what extent should it be done in-house, that Congress just appropriates more money for personnel and people are hired as employees? Or do you think that's not an important distinction?
No, see, I started off by saying Social Security, I think, is an exception, that they have a much larger and more competent federal IT staff. And I believe that the right proportion should be 70-30. By the way, the reason it's something like 70-30 is the right proportion is because what it means is that when the fluctuations in your IT budget fluctuate, as we've talked about earlier, it means that you can fluctuate by reducing the number of contractors, because it's much more difficult to reduce the federal staff. So the 30% contractors, I think, is where you have flexibility from year to year if your budget changes. But so I'm a big fan. I think I'm a big fan of growing in-house talent. I think that's what you need to do, because the talent tends to stay. You have people now that have been there for 10 or 15 years. They understand your business, and the contractors just rotate. They just rotate and rotate and rotate. So it becomes much more difficult to grow expertise in the business space. It's just a lot harder. By the way, it's a really hard problem, and I'm sensitive to this whole topic, but partly I'm sensitive because this shouldn't be construed as bashing the contractors, who I think most often do really fabulous work, but sometimes not so much.
And with that, why don't we turn back to questions from the public, because I think your comments are generating lots of interest. Claire, do you want to?
So Nancy, I'm going to jump in. So here's the question. What are your thoughts on how to change behaviors and build a culture that enables successful IT modernization efforts?
I mean, look, I think I alluded to this earlier. I believe that the fundamental thing that has to happen in IT is that the whole organization has to get their head wrapped around the fact that the technologies that they use are changing at such a rapid pace. I mean, just incredibly rapid pace. I mean, what, the iPhone's 12 years old. So 13 years ago, you would never even have dreamed of having to build an application that would be deployed on a mobile phone, right? So things are just changing so fast. I believe that the fundamental thing is you have to inject change into the organization. You have to ask people to change. You have to manage the increments of change so you don't break people. But the way it was 20 years ago was very static. You know, you worked at Social Security, you wrote code in COBOL, you used DB2, you know, and that environment just stayed the same for a really, really long time. And now it needs to change. There needs to be a new database introduced every 3 or 4 years, and a new programming language evaluated for every project, instead of thinking that you're going to standardize on one programming language across the whole agency. You just need to build an organization that is changing as rapidly as technology is. Even if they're 5 years behind the bleeding edge, they're still changing, because 5 years ago it was changing rapidly as well.
I agree with what Rob said, and I'd also add that culture needs to come from the top. Culture change. You need leadership that is pushing this.
Excellent. And Claire or Diane, next question.
Sure. This one's a little more technical in nature. What are your thoughts on using tools to convert legacy COBOL to newer platforms like Java?
So we looked at that very carefully when I was there trying to figure out how to do it. Here's the problem. I'm sorry, it's a technical question. This will be a little bit of a technical answer, but hopefully I can phrase it so that you guys will all see the problem. So right now I have 60 million lines of COBOL. The COBOL is old, which means it's not perfectly structured. It's difficult to get through. It's difficult when things need to be changed because of a policy change or a bug pops up. It's difficult to figure out how to get there and find the code that's broken and get it changed, because it's just difficult to read through and understand 60 million lines of COBOL. And at Social Security, there's a very small team of people that have been working with that 60 million lines of COBOL that's not well structured and not well architected. And they know the code like the back of their hand. They've been in and out of that code for their whole career. And so when a change needs to happen, you keep relying on the same 50 people to go fix it because they know the code. It's not about COBOL, it's about knowing the COBOL. If I could snap my fingers and the next day have all of that code spit out as Java, it's still not architected properly. It's still not modern architecture. It's not RESTful. The code translators don't do that. All it does is change it from COBOL to Java ball. And it would be like saying, Rob, we've all been studying and memorizing War and Peace, the book, in Russian for 20 years, and we all have figured out how to read Russian, and we know the book cold now. We know every chapter. And wouldn't it be a great improvement if I translated the book from Russian to French? Well, no, because nobody speaks French. And even if you did speak French, you would have a hard time trying to find your way through the book. So I started off by saying the programming language is not the issue. Converting from COBOL, unstructured code, COBOL to unstructured Java doesn't make it more modern, it just makes it old Java.
To build on that, we should, as we're modernizing, be thinking about how we can improve the process and improve the experience. This is kind of just a different way of saying what Rob was saying. Just because, well, perhaps a better metaphor would be, if COBOL is a square wheel, we don't want a square wheel written in Java. We want to round the wheel as we improve so that we get better and we get more efficient and we get benefits as we go. So wholeheartedly agree with what Rob was saying.
All right, I love your images and analogies. I'm definitely going to be remembering all of them, using them. That's great.
Nancy?
Yes, go ahead, Kim.
I have a great question. Kim again. Perhaps the two of you could help us, and I don't want to get into any security areas that we're not supposed to talk about, but as I think about the challenges that CIOs face, I mean, there's this whole area of cyber that they have to stay on top of. There's obviously, areas affecting the business operation. And then there's this need to conduct ongoing modernization. How do CIOs juggle those very different yet very, well, maybe not so different, but different yet extremely important priorities? And is it in an environment of constant change and budget challenges? It kind of in a way makes sense to me that legacy might take a backseat if it's operational. If it's generally working, okay, it may cost more. Social Security, for example, Rob's talked a lot about it. Some of their legacy systems, please God, so far have worked out very well. But how are those priorities juggled, and what advice do you give to federal agencies along these lines, or maybe, Kevin, what best practices are out there that seem to be working?
So I'll answer this hopefully in short and then turn it over to Rob, because Rob has this specific experience, especially at SSA and dealing with technical and development issues, and I have the kind of government-wide experience. So CIOs should be thinking about these things all the time. The problem is when you're doing development and not thinking about cybersecurity until the very end of the development cycle, which is all too easy to do in waterfall. Even in Agile, if you're not focused on cybersecurity, it can kind of take a back seat. So I think the advice would be making sure it's baked in from the start into everything you're doing is one way to make sure that you're thinking about cybersecurity. Cybersecurity also it's not a question of if you're going to get hacked or if there's going to be a breach, it's when, right? There's just too much going on. And so the conventional wisdom is defense in depth, having multiple layers. We're also moving towards environments like zero trust. Previously, it was kind of a trust but verify model where anything on the network was assumed to be okay. Now it's every time you want access to anything, you need to verify that who's doing that ask is truly validated on all sides. So that's kind of the government-wide purview. SSA does have it a little bit easier, as I alluded earlier. They don't have a bunch of components where the CIO has to be working with other CIOs at those components, and the more fragmented you are, the more chances of something that you don't know about getting on the network, which again, huge cybersecurity concerns there. So SSA isn't dealing with a lot of that kind of issue that the other agencies are, but just making sure you don't lose sight of it.
I gotta figure out how to keep this short, but in the infrastructure side, where the systems administration goes on, I think that there's several things that are that can be done that Social Security, I'm sure, is working on or was working on. I'm sure that probably continue, and that is things like encryption at rest, so that the data, when it's stored on a disk drive in the data center, is encrypted, so if a bad guy gets in, they can't read it. I think that the authorization stuff that Kevin just mentioned with zero trust, that's more focused on sysadmins than anything else, for all the right reason, because if you get a sysadmin's password, you have access to more stuff. If you're building a new system, I think that there's two things that go on that are really interesting. One is that for DCPS, we built this system so that every night the programmers checked their code into a library every night. And every time they checked it in at night, it ran through a series of tests that looked for bugs. And every night gave them a report that identified every bug that we found. And including in those nightly tests were all of the tests for vulnerabilities and penetration issues and stuff like that, so that every time a programmer injected any new code into the system, it was tested for vulnerabilities that would potentially expose that system to a hack from a bad guy. So that's how we dealt in a very automated way with not having the first part of cybersecurity wait until the very end. But the first part of cybersecurity is, how do you block the bad guys from easily getting in? The second part is, once they get in, because as Kevin said, they're going to get in. Once they get in, how can you detect the fact that they're in and limit their ability to move around? And then if they move around and find something, limit their ability to get any information out. And the modern way to do that is to log lots of information. You log every access to a file. You log every sign-on. You log every invocation of some software subroutine. You log everything, and you turn all those logs over to your security operations center, and they look using automated pattern detection software. They look to make sure that the patterns of access that they see match normal patterns of access, and flag things that look unusual. So that's how you detect a bad guy who's gotten in. But you can only do that if you're logging all of this detail and letting the SOC have access to it so that they can scan. And when you build a modern system, you log everything, partly for cybersecurity, but partly for other reasons, as a natural course of modern software engineering. So if you build it modern, you're going to do what Kevin wants, which is embed the capabilities to support cybersecurity right from the beginning.
Well, that's great. I see we're only 2 minutes away, and I know Kevin has a hard stop at noon, and we could go on for a very long time, Rob. I didn't mean to cut you off at all on that. But why don't you each, Kevin, you start. Any final thoughts, anything you didn't say you want to say, or anything you want to emphasize, and then Rob.
So just to recap, I think the main point is understanding that modernization doesn't mean you're going to save money. When we modernize, we get a lot better functionality, we get a lot better potentially security. We also get those ancillary benefits we talked about, where now the person answering the phone doesn't have to do a lot of hand entry, or may be able to better serve the customers more efficiently. They don't have that long lead up time to get trained. So modernization doesn't necessarily save money. It's going to cost money in many cases, and that's not a bad thing. But that's hard to do in a government where we're trying to be responsible stewards of taxpayer money.
Perfect.
So I guess all I would say is, there's ways to do this, and the way to do it is to just start eating the elephant. Don't agonize over where to take the first bite, and just start doing it. We talked about how using agile methods, you could start small and scale it up without, breaking the project. So just start small, just get going, just start. These things can all be solved. Even the big ones that everybody thinks cost $1 billion, even if it does cost $1 billion, $1 billion can't be the reason to never modernize, because somewhere along the way, the last COBOL programmer is going to die, right? So just get started and just go do it. Stop agonizing. Quit worrying about the programming language. Just start.
Yeah,
this stuff can be done.
It worked for Nike, I think.
Yeah.
So
Maybe the subtitle to this panel should be "How to Stop Worrying and Start Eating the Elephant."
Yeah.
So
tastes
Kevin,
like chicken.
Kevin and Rob, thank you so much, not only for all of your insight, and I feel like we want to have another session with both of you, but also for all the important work you're doing. And thank everybody who's joined today. Let me just conclude by saying that SSAV welcomes your feedback on today's event. Email us at events@ssav.gov. And again, thank you so much. Bye, everybody.
Right,
Thank you for having us.
Thank you.